Okay, imagine this for a second. One day, you're just living your life, and then boom, you find yourself stuck in a foreign prison. And the worst part, it's all because your own government made a mistake.
Yeah, it really does sound like something out of a movie, doesn't it?
It does. But,
Yeah.
for a man named Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, this isn't fiction. It's his reality. And, well, it's right at the heart of this really critical legal battle we're going to unpack today.
Exactly. We've been digging into a pretty significant new order. It's from the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, case number 25-1404, just filed April 17th, 2025.
Okay.
And this order, it really gets into the weeds of the legal fight over Mr. Abrego Garcia, who, like you said, was wrongly deported to El Salvador.
Right. And he's not alone in this lawsuit, is he?
No, he's joined by Jennifer Stefania Vasquez Sura and her child, AAV. And they're up against several government officials. People like Kristi Noem, Marco Rubio are named defendants here.
So you've got this, just incredible situation. An admitted mistake leads to a man being held overseas. And it sets up this real tension, right?
Definitely. On one side, you have the government asserting its power, especially, around immigration, foreign policy, that kind of executive authority.
But then, bumping right up against that, is this bedrock idea in the U.S. Constitution, everyone's right to due process. It feels like a fundamental clash.
It absolutely is. And, why this court order is so important for everyone listening, even if you're not, say, an immigration lawyer,
Right.
is that it cuts right to the core of how our government's supposed to function. And, the basic protections we should all be able to count on within our legal system.
But I'm talking big picture stuff here.
Yeah, liberty, government accountability, the rule of law itself, it's all wrapped up in this.
Okay, so the Court of Appeals, they issued an initial ruling. And it sounds like they weren't immediately buying what the government was selling, so to speak.
Well, they denied the government's request for what's called an emergency stay. Basically, a pause on proceedings and also a writ of mandamus, which is a kind of extraordinary court order.
And their reasoning, they call the government's request extraordinary and premature. Why that specific wording?
It's interesting. The court is essentially saying, hold on, let the lower court, the district court, figure out how to apply the Supreme Court's earlier instructions first. They're showing respect for the process. While they acknowledge the executive branch has a big role in foreign affairs, they just felt jumping in right now at this stage was, well, premature, not warranted yet.
Got it. But the part of the order that really jumped out at me, and I think will jump out at listeners, is the court's really strong language about due process.
Oh, absolutely.
They talk about the government basically claiming a right to detain residents in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process. That phrase, without the semblance, it's powerful.
It really is. The court is signaling deep, deep concern here. They explicitly state that this idea that the government could just detain people abroad without any basic legal safeguards, well, it should be shocking.
Shocking not just to judges.
Right. But, as they put it, to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses still hold dear. It's a stark reminder of rights we maybe take for granted sometimes.
And the government's main defense, as the court lays it out, seems to be, well, he's not physically in our custody anymore, so there's nothing we can do. That feels insufficient, especially when everyone agrees he was put there by mistake. How does the court respond to that no custody argument?
That's precisely the point the Court of Appeals tackles head on. They push back hard. They highlight the absolutely crucial fact that the government itself admitted the deportation was an error.
Right. They own the mistake.
Exactly. So the court asks pretty bluntly, why then should it not make what was wrong right? It's a direct challenge.
So the message is, you broke it, you fix it.
Pretty much. The court is making it clear that when the government errs, especially when it impacts someone's fundamental liberty, they can't just, throw up their hands and say, oh, well, not our problem anymore. They have an active duty to try and rectify it.
Okay, and this all traces back to an earlier Supreme Court decision, right? Noem v. Abrego Garcia.
Yes, exactly. From earlier this year, April 10th, 2025.
And the key word from the Supreme Court was that the government needed to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release.
Yeah.
And make sure his case gets handled like the deportation never happened.
That's the core instruction.
But facilitate. It sounds like the meaning of that single word is now a major point of contention. Why is the Court of Appeals digging in its heels on how to interpret facilitate?
This is really central to the current order. The Court of Appeals insists that facilitate isn't passive. It's an active verb. It requires concrete action. Meaning it's not enough for the government to just say, okay, we won't put up any legal roadblocks here in the U.S. That's what the government seemed to suggest. But the Court of Appeals says, no, the Supreme Court meant more. It requires actively working to get him released from detention in El Salvador.
So like making diplomatic efforts, providing resources, that kind of active help.
Precisely. They use the analogy, if you accidentally locked someone in a room, facilitating their release means more than just, say, unlocking your own front door. It means going to that room, opening that door, helping them out, active steps.
That makes sense. And the court seems worried that if the government gets away with this narrow, passive definition of facilitate, it could have bigger consequences. Something about habeas corpus.
Yes, that's a crucial connection the court makes. Habeas corpus, for listeners, is that fundamental legal right, that safety net that says the government can't just lock you up indefinitely without justifying it legally in court. It's the right to challenge your detention.
The great writ.
The great writ, exactly. And the court's concern here, what they're hinting at, is that if the government can mistakenly send someone to a foreign prison and then claim zero responsibility because they're not technically holding the keys...
It's like a loophole.
It's like an end run around habeas protections. By effectively transferring custody to another country, albeit by mistake, the court fears the government could be seen as trying to dodge this fundamental check on its power to detain.
That's a serious implication.
It really is. It touches on the core idea of preventing arbitrary detention.
The order also talks about this inherent tension, I guess, between the different branches of government, the executive versus the judiciary.
Right. They acknowledge the executive needs, quote, energy. That's a nod to the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 70, the ability to act decisively. But they firmly state that energy, that power, isn't limitless. It has to operate within the bounds of the law, within the Constitution. And that's where the judiciary comes in.
As the check.
As the essential check. Ensuring that even when dealing with complex issues like foreign affairs or immigration, the executive follows the legal rules. They're drawing a line in the sand, essentially.
It definitely feels like this case is pushing everyone to think hard about where those lines actually are. Where does executive authority end and judicial oversight begin?
It absolutely forces that conversation. The court isn't just deciding the fate of one person, it's weighing in on the balance of power itself.
And they don't seem afraid to voice some pretty stark warnings about what could happen down the road if things go the wrong way here.
No, they don't mince words. They raise serious concerns about future abuses. If the executive can deport someone mistakenly without due process and then basically ignore court orders to fix it, well, what's next?
Yeah, where does that stop?
Exactly. The court asks that question directly. Could this power be turned against others? Political opponents, other groups. They even point to recent news reports citing ABC News and Fox News specifically.
About what?
About this apparently floated idea of potentially sending American criminals to foreign prisons. The court uses these reports to illustrate the potential slippery slope they see.
Wow. So they're connecting this specific case to broader and frankly quite alarming possibilities.
They are. They're painting a picture of what could happen if these checks and balances erode.
Meanwhile, the actual person at the center of this, Mr. Abrego Garcia, his situation sounds just awful. The court mentions reports that both the U.S. and El Salvadoran governments are essentially saying, not our job to bring him back.
Yeah, the court explicitly references a White House briefing from April 14th where this apparent buck passing was mentioned.
So he's just stuck.
That's the court's deep worry. They describe him as being left in interminable limbo without recourse to law of any sort. It sounds like a complete bureaucratic and legal nightmare for him. Caught between two governments, neither claiming responsibility.
Just unimaginable.
Yeah.
And amidst all this legal wrangling and the dire situation for Abrego Garcia, the court makes a kind of plea, doesn't it, for mutual respect between the branches?
Yes, they do. They make a point of addressing the political climate, referencing what they see as concerning calls for judicial impeachment and a growing disregard for court rulings in some quarters.
They're pushing back against that trend.
Very clearly. They say, look, criticizing court decisions is fair game. That's part of a healthy democracy. But actively defying court orders, obstructing justice, that's different.
That crosses a line.
That crosses a fundamental line. They emphasize that the respect the courts owe the executive branch has to be a two-way street for the whole system of checks and balances to actually work. There's a real sense of alarm in their tone about the erosion of that mutual respect.
And to drive home this point about respecting court decisions, they bring up President Eisenhower. Why him? What's the connection?
It's a really potent historical example. They talk about Eisenhower's actions after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education 2, the school desegregation case.
Right, a hugely controversial decision at the time.
Hugely. And the court notes that Eisenhower, even though he might have had personal disagreements with the ruling, saw it as his absolute duty as president to enforce it. He sent in federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas.
He upheld the court's authority.
Exactly. The Court of Appeals quotes Eisenhower's belief that if the executive doesn't back up the courts, the whole system collapses into anarchy. It's a powerful reminder that upholding the rule of law, even when it's difficult or unpopular, is essential.
So putting it all together, the Court of Appeals isn't just ruling on a specific legal point here. They see this as something much bigger.
Much bigger. They frame it as a potential incipient crisis. Those are strong words.
But also an opportunity. What's the opportunity they see in this crisis?
The opportunity, as they frame it, is for the executive branch to step up, to demonstrate its commitment to the rule of law, to due process,
To fix the mistake.
to take the active steps required by the Supreme Court, the facilitation, and rectify this acknowledged error. It's basically a final urgent appeal for the executive to choose the path of law and uphold the balance of power.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's crystallize the main takeaways. What should listeners really hold on to from this complex court order?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a stark reminder of how vital due process is. It's not just a legal technicality, it's a fundamental safeguard.
Right, and that word facilitate, it means do something, not just stand aside.
Exactly. Active responsibility. Then there's the ongoing inherent tension between executive power and the rule of law. This case throws that into sharp relief.
And finally, the serious consequences, the potential slippery slope, if court orders aren't respected and enforced. The Eisenhower example really hits that home.
It does. And, this whole situation, it really pushes us to ask some bigger questions, doesn't it?
Like what?
Well, what does this case tell us about the real-world balance of power in our government today? How do we square the need for, say, national security or efficient immigration enforcement with protecting basic individual liberties, even for non-citizens caught in the system?
And maybe, what does it mean practically for someone who feels they've been wronged by a government action? What avenues are truly available?
Those are the tough, essential questions this case brings to the surface. Lots to think about there.
Absolutely. It's definitely a situation with ripple effects far beyond this one case. We really encourage everyone listening to keep mulling over these issues, maybe look into it further. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.